Welcome to another episode of Unzipped with Sherry, with yours truly. Of course, I am Sherry. Um, we have an interesting show today. So I don't have a guest as normal, and it's not because I don't love sharing your stories. Next week we'll get back to regularly scheduled programming. However, I've gotten a lot of questions over the years about the differences between the bypass and the sleeve. What is a duodenal switch? And it's been a long time since I've had the surgery, almost 8 years now. And so I decided, how fun would it be to do a deep dive into the origin story of bariatric surgery itself? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a deep dive. So I hope you guys are ready because we are about to get unzipped. We all have a story on how we got here, right? So for me, I used to be over 350 pounds until one day I made the single decision that I wanted change. Weight loss surgery has saved my life, and now I am here for you. I want to hear your story.
You know, the one that happened during that before and after picture?
It's time to unzip.
What's your story?
So again, yes, welcome to the show. I'm really excited. I actually had a lot of fun doing research on the whole topic and stuff. But before we start the show, I do want to have a disclaimer that I am not in any way, shape, or form a medical professional. I'm just a badass chick who had the surgery herself, and I share my story publicly, and I help people with advice and encouragement and support based on the experiences that I had. I also encourage having professionals come on the show so they can share tips and tricks and tools and resources for you guys as well. So we're going to have more professionals coming up in the coming future. And then in addition to that, we're going to keep sharing amazing stories. So as you guys know, the whole show of Unzip started with the book that I wrote a few years ago called obviously Unzipped. And now we have the show. If you want to check out future shows, if you don't get to catch the live show, you can watch us on Spotify, Instagram, Twitter, anything. It's all Unzipped with Sherry. So make sure that you come and check us out. I am kind of a shit show today. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm stumbling all over the place because I'm not used to being by myself and doing this show solo. So it is very nerve-wracking. Hey, Amanda, how are you today? So because I'm doing this solo, I encourage you guys to comment and leave notes and tips and stuff to be more interactive today. So if you didn't catch the very intro of the show, I thought it would be really interesting to do a deep dive into the history of bariatric surgery because a lot of people are always asking questions and I don't know the answer to them. So that's what I thought that I would do. Now, when it came to bariatric surgery, I know for me, I first heard about it back in the 90s. I had an aunt, my best friend's aunt. Hi, Bobby. Okay, thank you. You got this. I'm a shit show today, I told you. Anyways, so back in the 90s, I had an aunt who had the gastric bypass. And back then, I didn't know anything about it. I was probably around 15, 16 years old. I was still struggling with weight. By that time, I think I was already a size 18 at the time. I just assumed that I just needed to do more Jane Fonda videos or the Thigh Master or something like that. I didn't understand the process of why somebody would have surgery to deal with weight loss, but I was not one to judge in any way, shape, or form. So when she was explaining it to me, it was basically cutting your stomach and reattaching intestines. And I'm like, this is really extreme just to have, weight loss. But we know, it's been about, 30 years since then. Bariatric has become so popular now. It's more mainstream. A lot of people are talking it. Hundreds of thousands of people are having bariatric surgery every year around the world. And so I was just really curious because you're seeing so many things now on social media talking about our journeys. We had Jamie on a couple weeks ago who had it 25 years ago. So just in that time, how much it's changed and, grown from there has just been really interesting. So how do we go from not knowing anything about it to everybody knowing about it? So, excuse me. Another disclaimer is some of the information might be, you know, kind of hard on the stomach because I was doing a lot of research and some, like, whether it's complications or medical terms. I'm also giving you guys fair warning right now. I might botch some of these terms down the road, but like I said, I'm not a professional. There's no pop quiz at the end of it. Hopefully you guys can just follow along. And I honestly hope that you guys find it just as interesting as I did. So, the very first, I have to look at my notes too. So the very first gastric bypass surgery was performed by Dr. A.J. Kremen in, get this, 1954. Just looking at that alone completely blew my mind because it was 40 years since anybody even remotely knew the term. So the idea that the very first surgery was performed in 1954 just completely blew me away. So basically him and his team connected the patient's upper and lower intestine, thus bypassing the space where calories are absorbed. And then what was interesting is you don't really hear very much since then for like 9 years. So 9 years later, in 1963, this procedure was done again by Dr. Payne, Dr. DeWind, and Dr. Commons. But this time, they altered it slightly by adding the, now forgive me, duodenocolic shunt. Yeah, you can Google it. I tried Googling it. So basically, it was a surgical procedure where they remove like 30 to 45 centimeters of the small intestine, which was crazy. It was referred to as the jejunal bypass, which connected the upper small intestine to the colon. So this procedure at the time did cause a lot of steps backwards for patients in the form of uncontrollable diarrhea and other issues. And so between 1959 and 1968, this procedure was performed, but eventually they completely abandoned it altogether because the complications were just becoming way too common and quite severe. So they kind of had to scrap it and go back to the drawing board, which I'm like, I'm thinking that's a really good idea. So that was in 1963. So 4 years later of going back to the drawing board, in 1967, we entered Dr. Mason and Dr. Ito from the University of Iowa. So they revamped the surgery a little bit more, and they developed a mini gastric bypass, which basically stapled the stomach and then bypassed it to the small intestine. Back then, they were referring to it as the intestinal bypass. And so what they discovered was that they noticed that people who had like these large portions of their stomachs and intestines surgically removed, which at the time initially they were doing this already, but they were doing it for cancer patients and for people who had ulcers. It was a procedure they were doing where they had to reroute it, but they were noticing that in these patients, weight loss was starting to happen as a result from it. So then they're like, I think there's something to this. So this time around, the weight loss results were proving to be a little bit more successful. But again, it was the side effects that made them have to go back to the drawing board. Some of the side effects included anastomach leaks, which sounded really gross, and it is really gross, anemia, vitamin deficiencies, etc. So, but with that procedure, they were a lot closer to the goal. The complications weren't as severe as they were in prior attempts. So after some more revamping and retweaking, we now know that procedure as the Roux-en-Y bypass, also known as the gastric bypass. It was established by Dr. Scopinaro and Dr. Gianetta, which is the names of my peoples. Scopinaro, yeah, I'm a dork, whatever, get over it. So the Roux-en-Y, which I'm kind of curious if somebody can tell me like why it's called that, because I thought that was really interesting. But basically it connects the upper stomach to the small bowel. And what they were noticing is far fewer complications were happening as a result. So in the late 1970s, that's when Scopinaro and Gianetta were really utilizing this more. And then they noticed that by removing part of the stomach, it was obviously restricting how much food that the stomach can hold. And it was also diverting the GI tract beyond some of the small intestines so that fewer calories were being absorbed. So now that they got the majority of the kinks knocked out, it really wasn't until the early 1990s that it was being performed, which now starts to make sense because, like I said, I had an aunt that had it in the 90s. Nobody really knew about it or was talking about it. So it wasn't really being publicized. And even in the early 90s, nobody was really talking about it yet. But in the 1990s, there was 2 procedures being performed during that decade. One was called the gastric band, which we now know today as the lap band, which was originally introduced by Dr. Kuzmak and Dr. Yap, and another procedure called the duodenal switch, or for some of us, the duodenal switch, which I used to call it all the time. So the duodenal switch was in 1993, introduced by Dr. Hess and Dr. Marceau, which was originally used to aid in, again, stomach ulcers. So it was really interesting how like you were working on rectifying one issue and kind of like stumbled across this other thing that can be used to benefit people down the road, which I thought was really interesting. So I've had a guest on the show, Chelsea, who had the duodenal switch. I've had other guests in the past, such as Emily, who's had the gastric bypass. And I've been confused as to what's the difference. Is it just 2 different names for the same thing? Apparently not. So during a gastric bypass, a surgeon shrinks the size of the stomach by making the upper portion into like the small little pouch. And then it connects it directly into the small intestine. Whereas in the duodenal switch, it basically is bypassing almost the entirety of the small intestine, which is where a lot of the nutrients are absorbed. So I thought that was really interesting. And so what's crazy is that first surgery in like 1957, it was 40 years before the National Institute of Health finally endorsed the gastric bypass or the Roux-en-Y as a valid option for weight loss aiding, weight loss surgery. But back then, even though it was being recognized and accepted, it was only to be used in severe cases of morbid obesity. It wasn't like anybody can just have it with an extra 50 pounds. It had to be like literally a life, altering situation. But what was interesting is I was also really curious to how did we get to how we are today with people knowing about it? So even though advancements are now being offered in the 90s, it wasn't popular. Like people, like I said, we weren't talking about it. We didn't know about it. So I was curious to know what kind of started the whole avalanche of the weight loss conversations. What I've totally forgot about was in 1998, Roseanne Barr had the gastric bypass procedure, and she ended up talking about it on a talk show. And she said her surgeon was Dr. Phoebe. And it was basically the first time that any mention of this surgery was done in a public forum on an interview. And then what was crazy is right after the interview aired, the interest in the conversation just completely skyrocketed. Now, back in the late 90s, it's so weird to like refer to it as like the 1900s. I don't know. That still like blows my mind. People still weren't actually in a rush to get it. People were just now starting to talk about, what it was because a celebrity happened to mention it. So it was a year later in 1999 that one of my all-time favorite girl groups, Wilson Phillips, Carney Wilson, announced that she too had gastric bypass surgery. She ended up talking about it online on some interview. And immediately after the interview, more than 500,000 people viewed that video online because now the internet was becoming more prominent. And ever since that had aired, or they watched it live, gastric bypass surgery increased threefold, literally overnight. So you went from having this surgery that nobody knows about to having this surgery that everybody's talking about it by the water cooler, which is just crazy fascinating. So then like 3 years later, then we had Mr. Al Roker, who famously talked about having the gastric bypass surgery as well. By then, 3 years had gone by since Carney Wilson. Al Roker's now talking about it, but it was Al Roker talking about it. I think it was on the Today Show he was on. A 40% increase in surgeries were starting to happen since compared to 2001, the year before Al Roker came out with his story. And then obviously, as we know, the rest is becoming history. It just started growing exponentially from there. So then I was curious. So a lot of people, I feel, it almost seemed like to me, half the people today are getting the gastric bypass, half the people are getting the gastric sleeve. So then, of course, my brain is like, when did the sleeve come into the play? Like, how do we get to this point? And why is it almost seemingly equal in like one option or the other? I had known that like some people talk about, the bypass is better if you have issues with GERD or acid reflux, whereas sometimes with sleeve patients like myself, GERD and acid reflux can increase. But other than that, I really didn't know what was the deciding factor between both of them. So if we're going to do a deep dive into the gastric bypass, kind of have to do a deep dive into the sleeve too, right? Good answer. I'm glad you agree with me. Stick with me. It gets better. So in 1979, the gastric sleeve was being performed already. However, it was originally designed as step one of the duodenal switch. So I guess originally the duodenal switch was in two parts. Step one was the sleeve portion of it, and then step two was the rerouting of everything into what it became as the duodenal switch. So it was originally referred to as the sleeve gastrectomy Scopenaro BPD operation. And I dare you to try to say that shit 5 times fast. I tried it last night. It was hilarious. Don't do it. It was first performed by Dr. Doug Hess in Bowling Green, Ohio. And after 20 surgeries of this gastric sleeve portion, the average patients were losing between 7 and 25 kilograms within the first 16 months. Now, obviously, in the US, we're one of those only countries that doesn't like the general metric systems used in the rest of the world. So I had to Google what that meant. So that's basically translates to 15 to 25 pounds within the first 16 months that people were losing just from the sleeve portion of this procedure. So it's kind of like a really nice process. And originally, the gastric sleeve was used to treat reflux. It was a reflux surgery that eventually they were able to adopt as part of the duodenal switch because, like I said, they noticed that people were starting to lose weight. So that was in 1979. So it was 9 years later that Dr. Hess created the vertical aspect. So he created the vertical stomach of the sleeve. And so this was done so that the first part of, the duodenal switch procedure, it was used to kind of help resolve dumping syndrome and ulcers. And then in, 1997, Dr. Anthone originally intended to perform the duodenal switch on a 13-year-old girl. And so she had a stone in her, biliary tract. So the biliary tract is the organs and ducts that make and store bile that release into the small intestine. So the biliary tract includes the gallbladder, bile ducts, and it's inside and outside of the liver. So she had a stone. And so that's why they were originally going to do this duodenal switch procedure on her. But in the middle of the procedure, they were unable to fully empty the duct. So he had to unexpectedly switch to the gastrectomy portion so that he can leave open this access for endoscopy surgery. And after the success of that procedure, which was unintended, they ended up realizing the benefits of like how this can help in weight loss patients. So they performed this procedure 21 times during the years of 1997 to 2001, 4 years time. And every single one of them had successful weight loss without having to transition to the full duodenal switch. So just by doing the gastric sleeve portion, people were getting the results. So now, if you remember a few weeks ago, I had Jamie on the show, who's this amazing soul. You can catch her on TikTok, and you can also go back into the other episodes and watch her episode. But I really wanted to talk to her because she had the surgery 25 years ago. And back then, just like with my aunt, the process was a lot different in that the scarring and the surgery itself was a lot more extensive, where I believe she said like the incision was like from breastbone and like from side to side. Like it was a huge incision. It took multiple weeks just for the standard recovery. So I just remember with her talking about that, I'm like, man, that is so gnarly. Like I couldn't imagine, knowing what I went through and then having to think about like how much worse it was for what she had to go through. So then I was curious to know, like, at what point did they start doing it laparoscopically? And then side note, apparently I have been saying laparoscopically wrong this entire time. And it wasn't until I was doing this research that it's actually pronounced slowly, laparoscopically. Laparoscopically. Yeah, I can't freaking say that. So it's laparoscopically moving forward. So then I was curious, at what point did we start, transitioning to this laparoscopic option? Well, I'm so glad that you asked because I have the information right here. So picture it, 1999. Dr. Gagner performed the duodenal switch on a pig using it laparoscopically. It was proven to be such a success, and it was then soon after accepted as a suitable option for the sleeve gastrectomy part of the duodenal switch. But one thing that they noticed when they were doing it laparoscopically, if the BMI was over a certain number, the complications were increased. So then when they started doing laparoscopic procedures, they would only do it when people who had a BMI of 71 kilograms or less, because then anything above that, they would have to do the traditional duodenal switch the way that they've been doing it, like cutting you open entirely. So as the sleeve gastrectomy was proving to be effective on its own before having to do the full duodenal switch or even the full Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, it was becoming a safe laparoscopic option for treating obesity. We are turning a page because I got so many notes here. And so what's interesting is that today, the gastric sleeve is becoming more widely performed than the gastric bypass, which I thought was really interesting. And the gastric sleeve now takes up 65% of all of the bariatric surgeries worldwide. What I also found really fascinating is that 17% of people who have the gastric sleeve will eventually go into the full route and doing the full bypass. They call it now like the revision surgery, like a gastric revision. And like I said earlier, I think one of the reasons that a lot of people are doing that is because one, a lot of times, or it can happen with people who've had the gastric sleeve, that it kind of exasperates the GERD and the acid reflux issues. So as a result, there's a handful of people, 17% I just learned, that are doing the revision to the full bypass. And then often, once you have the bypass, a lot of the GERD and the acid reflux goes away. I had a brain fart. And then another reason people will have the revision is because, just like Emily said, sometimes people don't get the optimal results that they were hoping, or the weight loss was not coming off for whatever reasons, or some people have regain, and then they can revert it or transition into the revision and have the full gastric bypass. So I don't know if you're like me, but I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to numbers, and I love learning about stats, and especially with the surgery, because like I said, it's becoming so popular. I wanted to know more about it. What was extremely eye-opening is I found out that according to the CDC data in just 2016, 1/3 of all Americans are obese. Over 1/3 of Americans, it was like 36.3% of Americans are considered obese, which one is extremely heartbreaking. And two, I think a lot of it has to do with just, the large portions we have. I mean, there's so many variables and other factors. So not only is 36.3% of us Americans obese, 13% of the world population is also obese. So I don't know if Bobby is still watching this, but when I had Bobby and Ken on the show a couple weeks ago, one of the main questions that we were asked by people is, why are men not as vocal about the surgery than women? And both guys didn't really have an answer for it. We were kind of guessing like maybe it's because there's more shame for men to do it, or maybe it's not masculine enough. However, I learned that maybe one of the reasons that not a lot of men are talking about it is because 76% of all bariatric surgeries are women. So when I learned that, that makes a lot more sense why more women are being very vocal about it. It's because more women are just doing it compared to men. So I thought that alone was freaking fascinating. And then obviously, I think it was like most bariatric patients before having surgery had 3 to 4 different or additional comorbid conditions. Some of those conditions are not limited, but also include diabetes, hypertension, apnea, arthritis, PCOS. I personally love a good smorgasbord, so I think I had a little bit of everything before I had the surgery. Like you guys know, I had once was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I was having hypertension. I don't remember having the sleep apnea per se, but I definitely had arthritis. My knees, my back were constantly in pain, even as a teenager. And I too had PCOS, which I'm learning. And the more women that I talk to who have this surgery, PCOS is a very common underlining element to their obesity and their issues with losing weight in general. I just thought that was fascinating. So for those of you who are on the fence about bariatric surgery, this stat blew me away. So one, they said that the average hospital stay for bariatric surgery is 2 to 3 days, which I think that's normal. Some people only have to stay one night. I had to stay 2 nights, but I think one of the reasons was because the anesthesia made me so nauseous and I had an issue with keeping fluids down. So they kept me an extra night, but a lot of people only have to stay there for 1 night. But with that being said, the survival rate of bariatric surgery today is 99.95%. I kind of wish that I knew this when I was having the surgery, because I think for most of us, the biggest concern we have is, what if we don't wake up? What if we don't survive having a major surgery? That was probably the biggest concern I had. And not joked, but we've talked about it before. Like I recorded like a virtual will and testament the night before, because there was an element that this was going to kill me and that I wasn't going to survive it. I wish that somebody showed me a flashcard that said 99.95% are going to be just fine. And like Emily said, unless you're Emily and you have an asthma attack, then you might have to stay in the hospital for 10 days, which that was her case. And if you want to watch her whole story, her episode is up on YouTube, on Facebook, on Spotify. You can go back and listen because she has an incredible story too. Okay, so I'm retarded. I'm stupid. But this is one of my favorite stats about this surgery. So I don't know about you guys, but one issue as a woman that used to always frustrate me is that men lose weight faster than women. You can have a man and woman, same weight, same height and everything, and you guys decide, hey, we are going to learn, or not going to learn, we are going to lose weight together. We're going to be on this train together. We're going to work out. We're going to eat healthy. The woman might lose 5 to 10 pounds of water weight the first month. The man is probably going to lose 20 pounds or more the first month. And you're like, what the smurf? I'm working just as hard as you. Why are men always losing more right off the top than women? And yeah, you can tell me blah, blah, blah. It's because of muscle mass, or they have more muscle or whatever. But it's extremely discouraging. At least it was always discouraging for me. So I loved that the excess weight in men and women is different when it comes to bariatric surgery. Now, there's no clear explanation as to the why, but women typically lose more excess weight post-surgery than men. So suck it, men. We're finally going to beat you on something weight loss related. Obviously, I don't really mean that, but yeah. So this was really interesting too, was that in 2019, now keep in mind, this is now like 10 years after Roseanne Barr had mentioned that she had the surgery. 10 years later, in 2019, in the United States alone, there was an estimated 278,000 surgeries performed. I thought that was absolutely mind-blowing. I have to get my notes. I'm so excited. So I was trying online. I know I'm not like a shit show today because I'm by myself. I was trying to see if there was a way that I can post this picture up there for you guys to go over some of the stats. So unfortunately, I had to print it out. There was no way for me to be able to show it live for you. So what I will do is in the episode. Oh, I'm sorry, Emily. Oh my God, you're totally right. So it was 20 years after Roseanne Barr talked about it. So clearly I have fog brain right now. I totally forgot about 2009. That decade really shouldn't have existed. So I have this chart, and so I'm going to give you some of the stats just because I thought it was so interesting. And what I'll do after the show is I'll post the link on this episode so that you can see it for yourself. But what I thought was really interesting is in 2011, so this was published this year, and it basically covered the time frame of 2011 to 2020. And so in 2011, there was almost 60,000 gastric bypass operations, almost 60,000 of just the bypass. Now for the sleeve, it was just under 30,000. So at the time in 2011, the gastric bypass was still the most popular option at the time. Now back in 2011, people were still doing the lap band. There was about 55,000 surgeries in 2011 alone in the US that had the lap band surgery. What I found really fascinating is as each year progressed, the transfer from bypass to sleeve was slowly changing too. So for instance, in 2011, like I said, almost 30,000 surgeries, almost doubled 1 year later. There was almost 60,000 surgeries for the gastric sleeve in 2012. Now, the bypass, however, only increased by a few thousand surgeries. So the following year, more people were having the sleeve than having the bypass. So Bobby said, are you actually going to go over everything you wrote down? I didn't know that was possible. Yes. So the running joke is I make all of these notes. I have all of these questions and I never get to any of them, or I usually get to a couple of them. But Bobby, because I'm doing this solo today, I did not want to be an utter and complete shit show. So I needed to have as many notes as possible so that I can get all the information out. And I had to do phonetic spelling because I didn't want to botch names. So going back in 2012, 57,000 people had the sleeve, 64,000 people had the bypass. So it's kind of like this race around the track, and they're kind of like neck and neck right now. But in 2013, the gastric sleeve kind of edged them out a little bit. So we grew 75,000 gastric sleeve procedures in 2013 to 61,000 of the sleeve. And the lap band is dropping dramatically again to only 25,000. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the stats every single year because I don't think you guys want to hear all of that. But just in comparison, from 2011, we had 28,000 sleeve surgeries in the US. By 2019, there was 152,000 gastric sleeve surgeries performed just that year, which is absolutely insane. And I know I do math for a living. I'm not even going to try to figure out that percentage right now, the percentage of growth. You guys can figure it out. You can leave it in the comments. But you would think that the bypass would have just as much growth. We had 57,000 in 2011, whereas in 2019, that number dropped to only 45,000 gastric bypass procedures in 2019. And talking about going into a really big slump, the lap band in 2019 had less than 2,500 procedures done. Now, I know that there's a lot of doctors that really don't perform the lap band anymore. I think like I said, I'm not a doctor. I don't have the stats on that, but I think a lot of it had to do with there was a lot of complications. that had come with the lap band over time. And then not only that, they weren't getting the results that they wanted. And so a lot of people who did do the lap band, a lot of them were getting it reversed and transferring it to the sleeve or the bypass procedure. And then we're finally getting the results that they wanted. So I thought that was really interesting. So in the year 2011, total bariatric surgeries totaled about 158,000 surgeries. And by the time 2019 came, it was 256,000 people had bariatric surgery. Now, obviously in 2020, the number had dipped because a lot of surgeries were being canceled at that time because of the pandemic. I'm actually really curious. I didn't have the data for 2021. I'm really curious to see like how much that could have changed or how much that could have like increased. So Emily asked, yeah, but weren't they all mostly based on what their doctors recommend? Yes, 100%. So it wasn't that people were like going at a buffet and like, yeah, I'm going to have the sleeve today or I'm going to have the bypass. No, these decisions are obviously made with the doctor, usually depending on what your BMI is, what your health history is like, what your situation is. Usually it's going to be determined by you and your doctor, whatever is most comfortable for you. I think just what's happening is a lot of doctors are noticing that they're getting just as good of results from the sleeve. And so a lot of them are doing that first. But depending on your medical history, like I said, if you already suffer from acid reflux, a lot of times they're not going to offer the sleeve as an option for you, or depending on your other comorbid ailments that you have, that's going to help determine which procedure is going to be best for you. So obviously, first and foremost, always make sure that you discuss it with your doctor and you find the solution that works best for you and for you alone. It doesn't matter what I've done. It doesn't matter what other people have done. This is about you and your body. Oh, interesting. So yeah, like Emily had said that she initially had gone in for a consultation for the lap band. And then the doctor said that she should get the bypass based on the weight that she had to lose. And she was 5'3" and 340 pounds. And then shameless plug again, go and check out the episode Unzipped with Emily on Spotify and everything like that. So what I also found was interesting, I know a lot of people, especially here in the United States and especially here in California where I live, a lot of people are getting their surgeries done in Mexico. And I noticed like even like in Europe, Turkey is kind of like the European Mexico where a lot of people are going out of country to getting the surgeries. And I was curious to know what the stats were on that, just because I do have a lot of people who are looking into getting it in Mexico or have had it in Mexico. So what I thought was interesting is most recent data showed that about 6,000 to 8,500 of the procedures are being performed in Mexico. But one of the biggest reasons that people are going to Mexico is not just because of the affordable cost, because obviously it is cheaper to do it in another country. But I didn't know this, but Mexico has some of the best institutions and globally acclaimed bariatric surgeons. I thought that was fascinating. And it's also a lot more comforting to know for people who are looking into going elsewhere for their surgery. Obviously, make sure you do extensive research, check out the facilities, check out the reviews, talk to the doctors one-on-one. So I thought that was really interesting. And I've probably been saying interesting a lot today, but I'm telling you, everything is so interesting about this. So you have all of these different procedures, the gastric bypass, the gastric sleeve, the lap band, the duodenal switch. And I was like, what exactly is like the main differences between them? So we know with the gastric sleeve, which is what I had, is they basically take your stomach and they remove like 70% of it. They kind of reshape it into like this tube shape, and then they staple it, and everything is still attached. It's still attached to the esophagus. It's still attached to the intestines. It just restricts what you can eat. And then one thing that I had been told was that there was a hunger hormone and that it's removed during surgery and that controls hunger. And I kind of thought for a long time that I was like, maybe I'm just talking out of my ass because I don't know. I've never seen anything. Well, it's true. And not only that, the hormone is called ghrelin, and it's known as the hunger hormone. And yes, it is true that hormone is removed during surgery, which controls cravings, doesn't make you hungry, which is something that I have been saying since day one is I don't crave anything specific anymore. Like I don't crave food. Coming from somebody who had such a big sweet tooth, I loved my carbs. I could like think about a pie and then I would just start drooling and I had to have it. And ever since the surgery, I didn't have that anymore. But we still joke that I'm a visual person. So if I'm sitting at a table and there's something on the table that looks appetizing, that's now all I'm going to think about until I have it, and I'm going to actually crave it even more. But I thought it was really interesting that there was validation to something that I had been talking about for years, and that there was truth to it, that the hunger hormone is removed during surgery. So that was fascinating. And it has a name, and it's called, what did I say, ghrelin? Yeah, it's called ghrelin. The lap band, like I said, for those of you who don't know, the lap band was like this little instrument that they kind of like this band that they would put around the top of your stomach. And then they would fill it with saline and it would tighten the stomach and it would restrict how much food that you can consume. And then over time, you can have it loosened, you can have it restricted more. I think like I remember a friend of mine had the lap band. She ended up getting pregnant. So they were able to loosen the band so that she could consume more for her and the baby. And then the gastric bypass is like we were saying earlier at the top of the show, where they kind of separate the stomach into two parts. And then the small portion on the top, they kind of create this pouch and then they reattach it to one of the intestines. So it bypasses the majority of the stomach and it causes you to eat less and absorb less calories. So, and one of the reasons I wanted to mention that is because, like I said, when I had Chelsea on and she was talking about the duodenal switch, I'm like, what is that? Is that just a fancy name for gastric bypass? Is it like kind of like a different term in another state? And I was like, no, each of these surgeries has different benefits, different purposes. But at the end of the day, like Emily even mentioned today, at the end of the day, the surgery that you choose is going to be dependent on what you and your doctor decide, what is best for you and for you alone, based on your medical history and all the other variables and environmental issues that go on with your life. So couple quick plugs is that for those of you who know, I did write a book all about my story. It's called Unzipped. You can get it on sherryarcuria.com. If you're unsure how to spell it, it's right here on the screen. Bloop, 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 right there. I'll also put the link on the episode for you. So you can get signed copies of the book on there. If you don't care whether or not the copy is signed, that's up to you. No harm, no foul. You can also get it on Amazon. You can search for Unzipped by Sherry Arcuria, and you can get your copy on Amazon as well. It's also available on Kindle. And then I do have a company called 3knuckleheads.com who have been very generous and want to support the show. So you can get Loungefly bags on there. You can get really cool Comic-Con accessories. I actually met them going to Comic-Cons years ago. We became very good friends and they support the show. So they wanted to give me a coupon code. So if you go to 3knuckleheads.com, that's the number 3, knuckleheads.com, because if you met them, like the name is so fitting. If you use the coupon code Unzipped, I think you get 10% off your order. They're amazing guys. They do a lot of the Comic-Cons all around the country. So if you ever find them, make sure you give them a name drop in person and I'll make sure that they hook you up. But their stuff is really good. And basically, like I said, I wanted to do this episode today because, you know, we talked to so many, like I've been blessed and I get to talk to so many people and share their stories and their journeys. And I was like, all of these lives are changing. Like we're getting a second chance at life and we're being able to do things that like we never thought were possible. And like, we really just have the second chance at life. And I'm like, I feel like we need to give the industry the due credit. Like this tool, this surgery has completely changed my life. And I kind of wanted to know more about it. And I wanted to do like this deep dive and really get into like how this came to be. When I learned the very first surgery, albeit it was probably not the most successful surgery, but this 1957, like that's crazy. Like 60 some odd years, like it was just so unfathomable to me that like I learned so much in doing like this little deep dive. I'm hoping that you guys learned for it too. And like I said, the very top, I'm not a medical professional, so I probably botched some of these words and things. I'm just a chick, who, like I said, who had this surgery. It completely changed my life. And I want to do everything in my power to help empower you guys and inspire you and motivate you that if I can have these amazing results, and if I can have this amazing, life that I always dreamed that I had, I want to show that you guys can do it too. And so if you're interested in sharing your story, please reach out to me. I love hearing about your stuff. I've been so blessed to have some amazing guests thus far. I can't wait to see like what the future is going to hold with more guests. And then if you're thinking about bariatric surgery, obviously don't just take my word for it. Ask a lot of questions, have multiple consultations if you need. You want to make sure that one, you're really comfortable with the doctor that you choose who has your best interest at heart. No one's going to know your body better than you do. So if you ever have like a concern or it's just not feeling right, there's other doctors out there that are going to be a better fit for you. And I know that people are afraid to ask questions. Me, like I ask a million questions. Probably why I do a podcast right now, and my shows are usually just me asking other people questions because one, it takes the focus off of me and I don't have to talk as much. But two, I'm just so curious about things. So yeah, and like I want everyone to be the very best version of themselves as possible. My life, I know I say this all the time, but my life has truly changed as a result of this surgery. But I also want people to know, I get messages and people like, I'll post a lot of before and after pictures and people will see my after picture and they'll send me a message going, tell me about this experience because now I want it or now I'm thinking about it. And yes, on the surface in that picture, it looks so wonderful, but I think people just don't realize how much really entails into going to this journey. Like people who've been commenting today, like talking to Emily, talking to Bobby, talking to Amanda, like this was definitely not an easy thing to do. And as we like learned today and just looking at the history of it, there was a lot of trial and error that went into this. A lot of the things that it didn't talk about in the stats was other complications that could happen, and not necessarily complications, setbacks. Having to deal with like the mental struggle of emotional eating, having to deal with the emotional struggles of regain, having to deal with transfer addictions. Like there's so many other things that I kind of wished I was able to find more stats on. So we might have to do another deep dive that kind of goes beyond the initial surgery itself. But if you guys ever have questions based on my experience, like I'm an open book. You can reach out to me. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I think I'm on Twitter, like we're streaming live on Twitter right now. But basically, this is not an easy thing to do. It has so many amazing rewards attached to it that, in my opinion, it was worth everything. But it's not a decision that you can come to lightly. And just because you see somebody's before and after picture doesn't mean that there wasn't a struggle there. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. And yes, I'm a big advocate for the surgery itself, but I will never be one to tell you to go out and do it. And like I said, because only you can make that decision. If you asked me, should I do it? I can't answer that for you. Like, I honestly can't. I know that there's people who will be like, yes, go do it, run, like make it happen. I'm not one of those people, just because this was a huge decision that I thought on and off about for so many years. I had the thought in the 90s when my aunt had that surgery, like, could I do that? And I was like, there's no way I could do that. Maybe I'm just not trying hard enough. Maybe I'm just not, doing what I'm supposed to do. And I literally would have these thoughts for the next 20 some odd years myself before I finally decided to have the surgery. But if it's something that you decide to do it and you're going through the process and you need guidance or help or just someone to listen to, somebody who's been there, you can not only reach out to me, but there's so many resources out there now, whether it's prior guests that I've had or different support groups on social media all over the place. And like I said, we all deserve to be the best version of ourselves, whether that's in regards to weight and obesity, whether it has to do with your career, your family, your friends, or any avenue that you want improvement on. So the way that I really kind of wanted to leave off the show for today, we'll probably end it a few minutes early unless people have any specific questions or comments that they want to ask during the show, is your homework for this week is, or at least for today, is to do something today that's going to make tomorrow a little better. Whether it's going to improve you in some way or if it gets you in the right direction. I wish that you guys all truly knew or know. I know sometimes we get so inundated with life and we fall behind and we think that it's too overwhelming. Sometimes just taking the smallest step is still going to get you to the destination, and it's going to get you further than had you done absolutely nothing. So don't think of it as an all or nothing mentality when it comes to overcoming any kind of an issue or goal or dream that you have. As long as you're doing something, even if it seems minuscule at the time, you're one step closer to your goal than had you just stood there and sat and thought about it and done nothing. So do something today that will make tomorrow a little bit better. And then again, like, I really appreciate all of you guys who are watching the live shows. It's live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn now at Unzipped with Sherry. If you're unable to watch the live shows, you can always go back into all of those platforms and watch it at a later time. And now we're available in audio version. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple. I think we're on iTunes. I think we might even be on Pandora. I have to double check. But you can all go to any podcast resource and type Unzip with Sherry, and likely I'm going to be there because I'm going all over the place. You can also go to my website, like I said, sherryarcuria.com. You can subscribe to updates. There's a blog on there where I blog about my personal life and like what's been going on lately. And then I also have a blog from the journey from the beginning. I started blogging from the first day, that the night before my surgery, and kind of told my story. Like I said, you can also get my book on there. Another shameless plug, Unzipped with Sherry, where I literally talk about my struggle with obesity. And then I also talk about, the whole entire process with the surgery, the good, the bad, the ugly, the ups, the downs, the emotional setbacks, the NSVs. I want it to be as raw and honest as possible. And then finally, again, if you want to share your story, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. And so on that note, I hope you guys all have an amazing week. I hope you all do something today for yourself that's going to better you in some way. And then I guess I'll just have to see you next week. You guys have